Tell us what you suggest about how we approach the review of the final staff draft Delta plan, please.
Well, Mr. Chair, what I'd like to do with this is start off and I want to walk through how we've got where we're going, provide an overview, and then I will turn it to Dan or actually Cindy Messer, who's going to talk about the schedule. But I want to provide an overview about what's changed from the fifth staff draft back in August to the final staff draft that you now have, and summarize why I feel this draft meets the requirements of the law. Not that there aren't things to be changed, but I think it's come a long, long ways, and we're really close to something that I think will be acceptable. I wanted to take time at the very beginning of this process to commend staff, because it's not been an easy process. And I think they've done a really, really skillful job of trying to blend input from the council, from stakeholders, and to put together an integrated draft that makes sense to people. Jessica, who just sat down, has done yeoman's work trying to make everything understandable. Cindy and Dan, the three people that are sitting there, plus all of the other authors, have just done an outstanding job. I want to make sure I say that right up at the beginning. I also want to take a minute and talk about the big picture and the overall context of the plan, and explain why I think this is the right approach. You know, we've been working on Delta issues in this state for a long time. And if you go back, it was part of the plan that was crafted in the 1920s for the Central Valley, what became the Central Valley Project. And we fought about it in the 1960s. In 1982, the voters overturned the peripheral canal. It's something that we've been talking about, fighting about for a long, long time. The result has been scores of policies, laws, regulations, some that are enforced, some that aren't enforced, some that aren't implemented in a coordinated way. Really, most aren't implemented in a coordinated way. The policy environment is really complex. I think that's one of the reasons the council was formed, was to try and make that coherent. There are a lot of people that talk about one thing being the solution, a silver bullet, if you will. And we all know that that would be great if it would work. But as with many complex issues, nuance is a necessity, and I think that's what this plan is an attempt to do. We had comments from more than 250 organizations and individuals. They commented on various versions of the draft. Each comment was considered and helped shape the final staff draft in one way or another. When the Blue Ribbon Task Force actually initially created the concept of a Delta plan, I heard from some people the idea that, well, this should be a constitution, if you will, that overrides everything. And I don't think what we have here is a constitution, but I think it is a charter that kind of points out and tries to pull together all of the different regulations, all of the different laws, and lay out what the coherent plan is that everyone can follow. So the plan contains 14 policies, 68 recommendations. State and local agencies are required to be consistent with the policies, not with the recommendations. And it attempts to set forth a unified direction and restricts actions that can harm the Delta and highlights things that can be done both in near term and in the long term. An important thing that it does is it sets performance measures. And while those will be updated and improved in the future, it is, I think, a significant attempt to have measurable standards that we can use in the future. And it tries to knit together all the various regulations and laws and provide an overarching strategic guide. So we have all of this stuff that's been out there. Somehow the Delta Plan is attempting to make all of that into a coherent whole. So what's new? What I'm planning to do is walk through each chapter and talk about what we've changed, what people said about it, and why we've changed it. I think at the beginning we've heard criticism that the plan isn't doing or saying anything totally new, and I'd actually agree with that in some ways. One of the more frustrating aspects of water policy is that we generally know what needs to be done, but how we actually get there is not agreed by people, and we end up being stymied. So one of the things that's new about the Delta Plan is it is a hybrid approach, collaborative and regulatory. And that's something you gave us direction to do way back in, I think it was last summer. So it's something that CalFed was criticized for. I was actually brought in to be the executive director while we were in the process of evaluating what happened with CalFed. One of the strongest criticisms was that we had an authority that had no authority. That was a constant refrain. The Bay Delta Authority doesn't really have any authority. The council now has authority. You will likely be criticized for exercising some of that. But I think it was deliberate. That's why the legislature set it up this way. It is something that we have to do. I think there's been a lot of improvements in integration of the chapters, trying to show all the linkages and how things are traded off one against the other. So I feel really good about the plan. So with that, I'll go ahead and talk about the different chapters. Chapter 1.
That's great.
Sure.
I wanted to echo your comments earlier. First, certainly complimenting you, commending you and your staff for this fifth draft. I mean, I know all of you put a lot of hard work into it. I know you have gotten input from the public, so I want to commend the public for being there in terms of meeting with staff and trying to come up with a plan that I believe all of us should take some ownership of it, because I think all of us have played a role in it. So, Joe, I wanted to say thank you to you and your staff for the work that you've done thus far on the plan.
Thank you.
And just some of the comments I've heard overall in terms of this sixth draft is that it certainly is an improvement from the very beginning, and people do look at it as their plan. Some of them do. In fact, the chair and I were kind of talking, and I said one thing that I hope will come out of this whole process is that folks will take ownership of it. And so I think there's a little ownership in each part of it. Certainly there are some issues that are still needs to be clarified and worked through, but I think overall the comments I have received is that this sixth draft certainly is quite an improvement. It clarifies a lot of things, and so I think that's very positive moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you. So I want to kind of walk through the chapters and talk about what the criticisms were, what we attempted to do, and then we'll turn it over to Cindy to talk some about the schedule and how things move from there.
Can we start with the executive summary?
Sure. The executive summary is an attempt to summarize everything that's in the plan, and in some ways, Chapter 1 is a more detailed executive summary, as the introduction, and the goal was to tell the story better, to tell facts about the Delta, the history of governance, describe the plumbing. That was something, if you'll remember, Felicia Marcus asked for. So to describe the problem and add some background and context. So we got feedback from many people about the Delta Facts and Delta Vision sections that were helpful, so we retained those sections but edited them. New to this version is a map, a living map, we call it, of the Delta, found on page 19, that tries to present a graphic representation of some key aspects of the plan. So we've made improvements there. It's not perfect, but I actually feel that you can read this and have some sense of the story. It would be useful to an outsider who doesn't know anything at all to read the executive summary, read chapter 1. So that was the goal.
I would definitely agree with that. I think the executive summary is a little bit too pithy, and the introduction is maybe a little bit too lengthy, but I think taken together. And I'm thinking that many people, if we can get them to read just the executive summary and the introduction, we will have performed a wonderful, important public service. Now, do you want to go over this in some detail?
What I wanted to do was just do the general overview today, and then at the next meeting, come back and then go in some detail through the plan and get direction from the council. Because honestly, my assumption was that not everybody would have had time to read through the entire plan. And so my thought was we would go through this summary and get some general comments, but not do the detailed comments until the first meeting in June and the second meeting in June, where what I'd like to do is actually tee up some issues. We've already found some errors, some things, and so we'll want to bring those to you and say, here are things that were incorrectly done or edited out by mistake that need to be in here. And then here are issues. We have also given everybody a deadline of the 13th for comments. The 13th of June. And so our thought was that we would come back and say, here are the things that we've identified already that errata, if you will, that need to be changed. And then here are the comments that we received from people, and that we therefore be able to have a more organized discussion of the plan in detail.
Has the sixth draft received the benefit of a professional writer going through it?
It has.
It has.
It has.
A single person doing the whole thing?
Yes. So it has had that benefit. That doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's a significant improvement.
It is.
Okay. Thank you. Another part of Chapter 1 I want to mention is there was a lot of discussion about governance. So we added significant more information about the implementation committee and then about governance issues that the council may need to address in the future, because there are a number of governance issues that have been suggested by Little Hoover, by the PPIC, by a number of people. And while the plan itself doesn't address those, we thought it was important to lay out those issues and recognize that they may come back before the council in the future. Chapter 2 is a combination of adaptive management science with governance. And we've done several things there. One of the things we tried to do is to simplify it so that it makes more sense to people reading it. So adaptive management, if you'll recall, we had a 9-phase adaptive management framework, and some of the details about adaptive management we've moved to an appendix, and we have simplified the adaptive management framework, making it into 3-phase adaptive management: plan, do, and then evaluate and modify. We've also talked about the Interagency Implementation Committee in much more depth. That's something that was called for in the legislation, something that we all recognize is really important, but something we hadn't talked a lot about in previous versions of the plan. We identified members. My expectation is that will drive a lot of the work that the council does in the future, is that implementation committee of all of the relevant agencies. And then, as you'll recall, we had huge discussions about covered actions and what were covered actions. And we had workshops that Gloria Gray recommended. We had lots of discussions at the council. We've simplified that and moved a section into an appendix with more detailed explanation there. And actually, I've gotten very positive feedback so far. That seems to be something that we've gotten right, where people are saying, okay, we understand it, it makes sense. Now watch, I'll have people testify they disagree with it. But at least, so far, at least when people have talked to me, they say, no, that's a significant improvement. And I feel like it's a real significant improvement. We took a lot of comments from a number of people. One of the main comments was the statutory exemptions and categorical exemptions in CEQA. We said unless there are exceptional circumstances, all of those things are exempt from the covered action requirements because they are unlikely to have a significant impact on the co-equal goals, which is a requirement for something to be a covered action. So I think I feel really good about that change. We've talked about you before, but it shows up in this draft. I think it's a significant improvement. And then the last thing in this chapter is a much more significant recommendation for a Delta Science Plan. And we've talked about that again here in the council, but while there have been a sentence or two about it in previous drafts, I think it's a much better explanation of what a science plan should be in this draft of the plan. I do want to point out that we've reorganized the chapters now because the next chapter is the same in that we have water resources, but after that, and we have ecosystem, we then went to chapter 5, which is the delta as place, because we were trying to follow the co-equal goals. So the way the co-equal goals are worded is with water supply reliability, ecosystem restoration, and doing it in a way that is consistent with the supporting the delta as an evolving place. So we tried to structure. So that's a difference in how the plan is structured. Maybe not noticeable to all of you, but to some people it will make things different, because what had been this chapter 7 in the past is now chapter 5. Or what had been chapter 8, in the past is now chapter 5. So with that, each chapter has an introduction. Each chapter has a roadmap of core strategies to achieve the key objective. There's a section that includes all of the policies and recommendations, all organized under the core strategy. So we're trying to make this more logical so people can say, okay, here is the goal, here are our core strategies, and here are the policies and recommendations that help make those core strategies work. So that's consistently in every chapter. And then in every chapter we now have a graphic timeline trying to depict the policies and recommendations and where they fall in that near-term and longer-term spectrum. With that in mind, Chapter 3, which is the water supply reliability chapter, has been revised to address a number of public comments. You're familiar with many of the changes. Many of them have been brought to you. Some of them have come back here many times. There are only 2 policies. One that's related to reduced reliance on the Delta, and one that's related to transparency on water contracting. But there are also then 19 recommendations. So it's a really important chapter. A few weeks ago, you had a chance to weigh in and shape the way that we define water supply reliability. I was interested that was something that the NRC panel talked about, is we should define what water supply reliability means, what ecosystem restoration means, so the co-equal goals. So, and you've seen a lot of this before, but that's actually now included in the chapter. So the chapter's narrative talks about where water comes from, how we're using it, and finally talks about the dearth of information. It's ironic, we have this multi-billion-dollar business in the state, but we don't really have all of the information that we'd like to have moving forward. So there are four core strategies: increase water conservation, expand local and regional supplies, improve groundwater management, improve conveyance and expand storage, and then last, improve water management information. Part of it in terms of performance measures is trying to figure out how we can focus on a delivery predictability index. That's something that's important. How are you going to measure what we want to do? And so one of the key things is a delivery predictability index. Chapter 4 is about restoration. And in this chapter, there are 5 core strategies. One is create more natural functional flows. And that's a change. The language is a nuanced change where we talk about functional flows, because our goal is not, as the chair of our independent science board said, to restore just natural flows, but to restore more functional natural flows. So you achieve the functions of the ecosystem and flows that are set up to help you achieve those. So that's a nuanced and important one that's a change in this draft plan. Second core strategy is restore habitat. Third strategy is dealing with water quality to protect the ecosystem. Fourth is to prevent and manage non-native species impacts. And fifth is to improve hatcheries and harvest management. So those were the core strategies. As part of it, we talked about 5 key locations in the Delta and try and protect those locations from actions that will cause us to not be able to implement the restoration activities that we think need to take place there. 3 of those areas are not just ecosystem areas, but they're also important for the flood system. So that's Yolo Bypass, Consumnes, and the South San Joaquin floodplain area. So we think those are really important things moving ahead. Chapter 5, this is the old Chapter 8, the Delta as Place chapter, if you will, and it's seen a lot of revisions. And as you'll recall, we had the Delta Protection Commission actually come to the council and present their economic sustainability plan. They made 38 recommendations, and this plan incorporates 25 of the 38, rejects just 1, and then defers 12. Most of the 12 that were deferred relate primarily to the BDCP and management of the Delta Investment Fund. So this incorporates a lot. That caused some significant changes. It has 5 key strategies. One is to designate the Delta as a special place worthy of national and state attention. The second strategy is to plan to protect the Delta's lands and communities. It calls for new urban development in the Delta to be limited to areas that current city or county general plans designate for development, or their spheres of influence or legacy communities. So it's a limitation to maintain agriculture, and maintaining agriculture as a primary land use, as a food source, a key economic sector, and part of the way of life is an important strategy. That's the third strategy. The fourth one is to encourage recreation and tourism. And the last one is to sustain a vital economy that includes a mix of all of the above, of tourism, recreation, agriculture, commercial, and other components. So there are 2 new policies designed to protect the Delta as place by protecting those urban areas and ensuring a role for Delta voices in significant projects. Another important point that Director Natoli, or Chair Natoli of the Delta Protection Commission, wanted us to focus on was the recommendation that we added urging that land for ecosystem flood or water projects be acquired from willing sellers first when feasible. So we didn't go as far as he wanted, but we made that into a recommendation that is now in that chapter. Chapter 6, water quality. Overall feedback on this chapter was that it was just too complex. So water quality is a complex subject, and we tried to make it look more accessible and less dense. Although, to be honest, I think it's still pretty complex. I think it's part of that's just due to the nature of the subject matter. The new organization goes a long ways to trying to make it more accessible to people. And we're trying to focus on the trade-offs of water quality issues and refocus the reader on the importance of managing water quality for the beneficial uses. So it's not just for the water quality's sake, but it's actually the reason you do this is for beneficial uses. There are 4 core strategies here. One is to require delta-specific water quality protection. If you'll recall, we talked about that. There may be places where in the delta we think the state board should look at, or the regional board should look at, delta-specific water quality protection. So that's a recommendation. Second core strategy is to protect beneficial uses by managing salinity. Salinity is a key issue for many, many parties in the delta, and how we manage that is really important moving forward. Third is improving drinking water quality, and fourth is improving environmental water quality. So, and there are trade-offs in both of those. What's good for the environment may not be good for drinking water quality. So it's important to have those strategies, but also identify the trade-offs that are there. Reducing risks to people, property, and state interests is Chapter 7, and the key action areas there are to improve flood preparedness and emergency. So that was a key thing. Second was to reduce delta exposure to flood risk. And the third one was to set priorities for investment. And so we took a shot at developing priorities, which are in the policy there, and then indicated a process for developing those. This is a chapter where one of the key sentences got left out that we will come back with an errata, pointing out that it is our intent in this chapter to say very clearly that if entities choose to develop flood protection standards that go above and beyond what we're recommending without state money, that's perfectly appropriate. What we are prioritizing in this is what the legislature asked us to do is to look at how state funding should be prioritized. We're not saying if you own an island and you want to build it up to a 300-year flood standard, you can't do that. Chapter 8, funding principles to support the co-equal goals. This chapter, frankly, is really hard because we didn't really, as staff or council, have time to do this subject justice. So what we did was try and just develop some funding principles and to lay the stage for the development of a comprehensive finance plan in the future. We heard from you that the first step was to identify priority actions, which we presented to you, and we really want to move ahead with that with a lot of those things after we've done a full finance plan, and we think it will take another year to get that done. Key change in this chapter is there had been in the fifth draft 13 recommendations on finance. Most of these recommendations have been moved to the relevant policy chapter so that they aren't in that chapter anymore. This chapter has a lot of issues, but mostly the key issue is how do we go from here, where we have the strategies moving forward, to a finance plan that will support implementation of all of these elements of the Delta plan. So I've kind of walked through the chapters, and I'll turn it over to Cindy, I guess, to talk about the process moving forward. As I said before, what we want to do is come back with our own summary of things that we found in error in this draft that we just missed, and then tee up also the issues that come in from the public. And then the way we plan on doing this is the council at this point will make the decisions about what to change in the draft plan. So that's when we say it was the final staff draft. In the past, very often, we have just kind of gotten a sense from you about where you wanted to go. What we want to do now is actually have you tell us, make this change. So we'll tee those up as we move forward. And with that, Cindy.
Okay, thank
Yes.
you. And just to reiterate a little bit on what Joe had to say about the schedule, again, to remind folks that the comment period for the final staff draft ends on June 13th for written comments, and that will allow us time to consider those comments for incorporation into the final draft plan or the 7th draft. We have our first meeting in June on the 14th and 15th, and as Joe said, we will come to that meeting with a list of errata of changes. We will make an attempt to bring some summaries back of the comments received up until that point, knowing that the deadline for those is midnight the day before our council meeting. So obviously we'll have some that we'll need to bring back to the council meeting late in June, but we'll at least want to start that dialogue going. As Joe mentioned, on June 14th and 15th, we'll walk through the final staff draft in greater detail, chapter by chapter, receive comments from the council, again, talk about what we received from stakeholders through the written comments. At the end of the month, June 20th and 29th, what our intention is to come back as staff with some sort of document, whether it's a matrix again or a combination of a matrix and a document that really tees up all of the changes, questions, comments, edits that we've received from all sources, council, stakeholders, staff, things that staff have found, and walk through those with the council and for discussion and for final direction. What we would really like to do is get final direction by the 29th of June, so that last day in June at the end of the council meetings. What we will do from there is take the next several weeks in July to incorporate those revisions into the final draft Delta plan. And so right now our schedule has us releasing or publishing that draft Delta plan towards the end of July. At the same time, what will happen is we will commence the recirculation of the staff's proposed recirculation of a supplemental volume for the draft environmental impact report. We will also commence the process for the administrative OAL process. I'm blanking on what that is.
Office of Administrative Law.
Thank you. Thank you. So these processes will start to take place and move forward together, and we have some timelines for those. One thing I do want to mention, both with the recirculation of the supplemental volume as well as the OAL process, there is a 45-day public comment period for each of those processes. So we want to make sure that, especially our stakeholders, know that they have other additional opportunities for comment and review and providing us with feedback, not just this period of time between now and June 13th. So that's going to take us through the summer months, and what we're looking at in terms of the Delta plan schedule is sometime towards the early part of fall, we will publish a revised final Delta plan once we've received comments, made it through the 45-day comment periods. Sometime around November, December, the council will adopt the plan, adopt the regulations in the plan, and in the early part of 2013, sometime around January, February timeframe, the Delta plan will go into effect. And that largely has to do with the OAL schedule and the draft EIR process or supplemental process. And I can talk about those. I'm staring at Chris a little bit. I don't know if it's something you want to comment on at all. No? Okay.
Oh, well, I'll add a little
Okay.
detail there. What happens is, once everything's adopted, it still has to be published by the Secretary of State's office to take effect. So part of what we have is, once you're done, there are other things that have to take place before something takes effect.
Right. So in fact, I have them written down. So after the council adopts the regulations, we'll submit the regs to the Office of Administrative Law. They review it. They submit to the Secretary of State. And then there's roughly they have a 30-day time period for reviewing them, and then an additional 30 days before the regulations become effective. So.
Okay. I want to talk about just process and material for a minute, not content. The final staff draft is that. That is your recommended staff draft. We understand you'll have editing and errata changes and so on. I would like the document that we modify to be easily read where the changes we have made are identified. I'm thinking that something like a red line version might make sense. I expected, and there were, major organizational changes in this. But the difficulty of progressing through this means that this is not simply another version. I want to have, the next time we come to sections or language or something, I want to know what the staff proposed and then clearly what the council has decided or reserved as an issue or something like that outstanding. And that kept track of during the next 6-8 week process. And I think of two things. Consider the notion of staff editing changes in a color like green and council in a different color. I don't care, just so you can distinguish it. And the other thing is, I think we need an ongoing, this is my title, it's not the right title, council change sheet. So from meeting to meeting, this meeting, but really more importantly, the ones in June, a list of council directions, stated, clearly understood, recorded. If there's a vote taken on it, vote taken. Agreements, that language being proposed by staff for editing. I mean, essentially, I want a record made of what the changes are. If we reject something, I want that recorded. If we modify something, and then there will be, as there always are, questions and observations that come up. I want to keep track of that, because if we don't, this time frame just means we just kind of drift on. I frankly think there will be fewer items on that kind of a list than you would expect, but that's the benefit of a 14-month process with 6 previous drafts of the Delta plan. And Joe, I don't know how to do it, but I think we've got to kind of formalize our review and our decisions on these sections by sections, record them clearly so the members can look at them. Pat's minutes of the last meeting were an illustration of how we dealt with the matrix. It's not quite right, but it's close as to how to do it. And if the staff could think up a way.
We have been talking about creating a matrix, and then I think if we do that, what we want to do is actually put language out in one box to the side that says council decision, and so we have this issue on this language on these pages, here's the language, and then document it with a council decision and actually have, whether you do it by a vote and a motion or you do it by this is consensus from the council, we want to be able to document that.
Yeah, but here's the thing. In reading the plan, and I'm not completely through it yet, there are things that have been changed that I want to hear the arguments about before simply accepting them. So, for example, we had in the 5th draft Delta plan like a 4-paragraph little subsection, I think in the introduction or somewhere, what the Delta plan does not do, responding to some of the complaints that were, I thought, broadly overstated, but we responded. That seems to have disappeared in this draft. If it was a conscious decision that it should disappear, great. Let's hear the argument and make the decision. But I want to know what it is, and I want to know why and what the arguments are. So you've already heard me say I can't find anywhere in here the notion of a conservation-based fee structure for water districts, which has been a recommendation all the way through 5 versions of the Delta Plan and disappeared here. It's the only price signal we give in terms of reporting this. You advise me existing law already pushes districts, maybe even requires them in that direction. There has to be a reason for the plan not mentioning it, but I must confess I do not understand that reason. That's the kind of, so it requires a different level of organization. Again, I doubt that there will be as many issues on that list, but they're really important. The matrix works for me, but things that are deleted do not appear always on the matrix. So how we, part of this is just rewriting and editing and changing and different expressions. So I don't know how you're going to do that, but if we agree on a red line, a format, then we just simply ought to say that.
I like that idea of doing a red line with
then
our
let me make a
changes
suggestion to
that we
the
know.
council. I think it's time we start just doing it by vote or mutual agreement of the council on issues as they come up. If we are uncertain, we don't have the right alternatives, we ought to do it. But here's an illustration. I'd propose that we direct the staff to prepare, from this point on, to develop, I'll call it a red line. I'm open on a different way of phrasing it, a red line edition of the council-directed changes so that we can look at the document and see where the changes are. Now, open on colors and all, I don't care about any of that particularly. But I don't know. I don't want to lose track of things. I want to be able to see what was proposed by the staff, what we did that is different, and what issues remain. So that'd be my first recommendation too, just on process. I don't know, Randy, you've done these before.
I think that'll be helpful in achieving our goal of transparency and openness, because we're to the point now where, we've been to the point for quite a while. In fact, I got a comment at the Contra Costa meeting that Keith and I attended a week ago about how much different the 6th draft is from the 5th draft and how hard it is to identify what changes have occurred without going through the entire document line by line. So this will assist those who are following the process to determine very easily what changes are being proposed. I think it's a good idea.
Pat? Gloria?
I was just going to comment. I think the other reason why it's a good idea, because the council may not agree on the complete plan, but if you itemize areas that are really key issues, we can see what we can agree on, and then those areas that we may have some issues with, that we can debate and deliberate whatever on those and come up with whatever version the overall council can agree on. So I think that itemized list that you're suggesting is a good one to do, going through the process.
Dawn?
Yeah, I would concur. I think that's useful to, because we're now getting close to the 9th inning, at least on the Delta Plan, and its consideration for final approval and adoption. I think that as you described it a little earlier, Phil, I think that list will be probably shorter than some might imagine, but I do think it's important to reflect not only in the minute format, but as we go down through and there, wherever, as Gloria just mentioned a moment ago, our differences, to have some discussion, but get to decision point, and then whatever is decided will get them either embodied in the plan or not. But I do think that what you've suggested is a good way, and I don't think it overly compounds our process, and I think it'll be good from the standpoint of reflecting as, this is going to be a historic point when this plan is ultimately adopted, I think, how we got to that point. So I think it'll help council members as well.
Okay, I'd like to then suggest a motion for your consideration that the staff be directed to prepare a council action red line version of this, available for the council and public review after each meeting. I mean, there'll be a lag time if language has to be rewritten, but it should not be a long lag time. That give you any heartache?
No, just to understand depending on the complexity of what you tell us to do, it may take
Well,
longer.
I've got that. I've got that.
Mr. Chair, I would just,
John.
you offered, I think, again, if staff makes changes, I think that maybe that green line added as well. If they make changes either based upon their review and truing things up and/or
Yeah.
something else comes to their attention, I think that delineates between what the council either will direct and/or act on and what staff is either through comments received from the public and/or their own editing and review and truing up have arrived at. So I think that, again, not to get too many colors going here, but I do think that that's a good way to delineate.
And-
so we know what staff owns and what the council owns. So.
Well, and what I'd like to do is significant issues I want to bring to the council. And I would expect there may be some significant issues that will bring,
There'll be
even
new
that we
things.
agree with.
There'll be new things or new approaches that you're going to think about. There'll be some that you'll want to talk to us about, of course.
Yes.
Of course. Okay. I'd like to suggest a second motion that the red line action we've just taken be the first item on what I am tentatively calling a council action on final staff draft, Delta Plan, just so we can start having the summary of actions we take relative to the draft Delta Plan, and that action, or whatever it's called, list be the recorded action items from this point on. If that's okay. All right. Gloria.
The information, the red line information, will it reflect the comments of the council, or will it reflect the comments of staff based on public input? Where
Well,
does that
here-
part come in?
Here's what I'm not interested in meeting summaries with public comments other than what we currently provide in the meeting summaries, the public testimony, and so on. I'm interested in how the final staff draft is changed by the council and recording the set of actions relevant to that. And there will undoubtedly be issues where there are policy arguments from the public or from council members, and we can have some notation of those issues. But I just want to keep track of what the council does, not just, I don't want to create another duplicate record to the minutes of the meeting. That doesn't seem to make much sense. I don't want to try to duplicate the recorded hearing that's available for public review all the time. So I think this is really in the nature of council action on the final staff draft.
Those key issues that are still pending out there that people have some issues with, and Joe, I know you mentioned there will be some and not that many, but where will that enter into the discussion?
Well, in terms of a process, I believe, this is after 2 years of public hearings on this issue. I think most of the issues will not be surprising. I do believe that advocates who find this final staff draft Delta Plan did not accept their ideas will come back and want to argue all the ideas all over again. I'm not wildly enthusiastic about just doing that as a process. This is really developing the staff version, the council version of the Delta Plan. I think, however, that if council members have issues they wish to flag for attention in the process, they should do that. And that could even be a category of stuff or under this list of the actions on the final draft or issues for consideration or whatever you call it, Joe. I think that's a wise thing to do. But really, this is our Delta Plan version that if we approve it, will go through the process and become parts of it become legally enforceable. So the council members always have the right to propose adding, propose subtracting, proposed rewriting issues.
Yeah, I agree with that. The only point I'm making is that I would like to know what are those key issues still are out there, and maybe a few of them.
So I am assuming that we will, as staff, try and bring those to the council and say, here is what the
Still
stakeholders
pending.
have said,
Right,
so
which
that
is separate
you
from-
have that
Right.
at your meeting on the 14th and 15th.
Yeah,
And that's a separate. document.
And my assumption is that when we come back for the detailed chapter-by-chapter review of the final staff draft, we're going to do, as we've done in hearings, we're going to ask for public comments after the presentation and council questions have been made on that chapter.
Yes, that's what I assume too.
Yeah.
So, and my expectation is that there will be some number of language changes, particularly on policies or recommendations where people are worried about the exact words and how those words might be interpreted. So I expect, and the council will probably need to step up and say, we agree with this wording or this policy implication, and so I expect there may be 5 or 6 of those.
Okay.
Joe, you'll continue to post the public comment letters that we receive as they're received. And is there a plan to create a matrix of comment summaries as those comments come in to advise us now through June 29th?
There is a plan to do that. A challenge will be getting, if people are supposed to turn in their comments by the 13th,
Well,
having that done by the 14th is a challenge, although we'll try and get
The other
as much as we
complication
can.
is you're suggesting that you're going to do a recirculation volume, or however it's said correctly, recirculate a portion of the EIR that'll be encompassed in a supplemental volume. Is that what it's called? I think it's what it's called. And arguably, that is a way of analyzing what the previous EIR did not, either by way of new material or because for some reason we didn't analyze it. I don't want to create an opportunity, however, through this language to leave the impression that once we've done the volume recirculation, that all of a sudden everyone can come right back in presenting all of the things that they wanted to get but they didn't get, or new ideas they suddenly thought up, and we have to stop and go back and do it all over again. Chris, what's the right way to do it?
Well, whether or not it's the right way, it's the only way, unfortunately, because, as you're right, we have to follow the CEQA process and the Administrative Procedures Act process. You're going to hear the same arguments through those two processes. Cindy pointed out, that these are other opportunities for the public to come in and comment on a work product that is not yet finished. It's not finished until you adopt the plan come, November or December. And then, as Cindy pointed out, even after you adopt the plan, you've got to forward the regulatory package over to OAL, and the regulatory policies in the plan won't take effect until that process plays out. But your product, the Delta plan, isn't the final plan until you've certified your final EIR, and then you adopt the plan. That's going to take place in November and December. So what we're talking about here is you now have in front of you a final staff work product. Hopefully we can use that as the master to work off of, as you're talking about, Mr. Chair, and bring back to you proposed language changes. We'll keep a running tally, whether or not it's in blue, green, we'll differentiate so you know what the changes are that have been made or that we're proposing that you make. And then once you give us direction, in effect what you're telling us is that this final draft is going to be, in effect, the revised proposed project for purposes of this recirculation. So this is going to be your revised proposed project. We're going to go out. We're going to do the recirculation for 45 days. Concurrently, we're going to do the rulemaking process, 45-day comment period. We have to do what's called a rulemaking hearing, which is going to be one of your regular hearings, but dedicated to the rulemaking. So there's going to be plenty of opportunity for the public to come in. You are going to hear the same arguments that you've been hearing, so don't think that you're not, but hopefully we can close out the issues with regard to the direction that you've given. So.
Chris, this recirculation of the EIR, does that require a vote of the council?
The recirculation so far is based on a staff product. What we're highly recommending with regard to this final staff draft that we've presented you is, given the nature of the changes in the draft, the look of the document, the feel of the document, and pretty much your commitment so far to transparent process, good government, that recirculation is the way to go. So we don't see taking any other course of action but that, so I give that to you with my highest recommendation. What we will do as staff is take the changes that turn into this final draft and go forth with that process. But you'll be fully apprised. The final EIR, all that will be encompassed in, again, a final EIR that will come before you for certification come November and December before you adopt the Delta plan. Well, it's going to be based on the final staff draft that you have with the changes that you direct. So it's going to be, the nomenclature gets a little confusing, but you're basically going to be taking ownership once you give us direction to go forth on the recirculation and the OAL process. It's going to be your draft Delta plan.
But it does not require a vote of the council.
No.
Okay.
All right. Circling back, if we're clear enough, I'd like to, I'll make a motion that we develop the council action on final staff draft Delta plan, and as the first item, include the red line preparation of council changes, and as the second item, the maintenance of this list, and you can suggest changes in title for the council actions that follow until we adopt our own version of the Delta plan. Second, Ms. Gray. Discussion? Okay. Starting with Mr. Nordhoff.
Johnston, aye.
Gray, aye.
Theoretti, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Totally aye.
Okay, that's a 6-0. Okay. Now, on the rest of the Mr. Grindstaff's general summary and observation. Joe, I'm sorry, you mentioned, but do you have a sense of the errata, volume of erratas and technical changes in spelling? And there's got to be a lot of that stuff that happens.
There are. I mean, one map got put in incorrectly, and we found a sentence without a verb, and then a whole sentence or thing, a few things where things just got left out for whatever reason. A sentence here that was supposed to be in there got left out. I would expect, though, that it will only be 2 or 3 pages, and probably what we'd want to do is have a staff report and say we recommend that, as these were items that the staff would have put in there had we caught it before it was published, that the council approve us doing this and that it become a part of this draft. So we'll bring some kind of a staff report with that recommended action so that you see what they all are, and we just get that out of the way. And we'll probably continue to find things over the next couple of weeks, even after this next meeting.
And errata sheets are truly technical changes. They are not policy changes.
They are not policy
By policy,
changes.
I don't mean regulatory. I mean fundamental issue changes.
Right.
Okay.
So there, and I'll give you an example of something else that probably would come up as an issue. So we will try and summarize the comments of people so that they make sense. So this morning, Greg and Brenda were talking to me about a language change here or there, which perhaps does not impact the intent of policy or recommendations here. Those are not things that we would put into errata, but they are things that we would bring to the council and say, here is what the existing language is, here is what stakeholders are recommending, this is why they're recommending it, this is an issue, and you get to decide how you want that language to read so that you can actually make that decision.
Okay, I'd like to suggest that the third item on our little council action sheet be agreement that staff would submit errata statements on technical matters. I'd encourage you to do it, start doing it so we can clarify the stuff so we don't clutter.
We've already started the internal process of gathering all of that. So.
Okay, so let's do at your discretion, but as soon as possible is preference. Members, on this, rather than do a formal vote, let me just look around. Does anyone, is there any disagreement to that direction to staff? Any disagreement? Okay, with your permission, then we'll just record that as a 6-0 vote also. Okay. Don.
You want us to kind of jump in? I want to just, if I could, it may goes to the executive summary or the introduction. It seemed to me that early on, particularly if folks are just going to pick up, and maybe even to Hank's point earlier about the two, that you could go to a page and see the policy regulations. And I know some of those are a little lengthy, but it seems to me that you could go right immediately in front of the document if you wanted to see. Now, again, you need to have the background to understand a lot of those things, but I do think that if you're going to, a lot of people will just read the executive summary, they might pile through this, and some of this kind of, again, it's all there, and I think in a pretty organized fashion. I offer that as a suggestion. Obviously, the list of recommendations you can do is similar, but that would be many more pages. But I do think when it comes to those things, that ultimately will be the regulations that will be enforceable, that either in your introduction or your executive summary, right in the front of your document, that needs to be there in some sort of organized fashion. Again, it may not have the entirety of all the background that is offered with some of these. And so if you've got this, is that a chart, or maybe I can...
Yeah, page Roman numeral 9 is the content Delta Plan policies and recommendation list. That's the closest thing that comes to what you're suggesting.
Okay. So that list is...
Yeah, way in the front, Roman numeral 9. Yeah.
Way in the front.
Way in the front, right behind the table of contents, which is why people tend to miss it.
Then I must have gone right past it. Then.
Yeah.
Acronyms, abbreviations.
No, you just missed it. Go back. See? But that's a good illustration that without some visual highlighting, you could lose that. Don, this is it.
Okay. Yeah, I went right. I just went past just now again.
It's the policies and recommendations, the 16 policies and 60X recommendations, with the captions, as I understand that this is the captions that are used in the text of the staff draft and the page number at which it occurs. And I agree, this is a very helpful thing.
Okay.
But it is kind of lost in visually somehow.
Yeah, and well, thank you again. Even as we were looking at it, I was going right past it. So, and this just gives the title, and there may be that there's a short summary so somebody could have an understanding of what that related to. I mean, you don't want to lose anything in that translation, but I do think this from a highlight standpoint, and because executive summary, you wouldn't attach this, if you were putting out a printed executive summary, this probably wouldn't, well, it might, I mean, depending on how you organize that. So maybe there's another way to bring focus to it, because a lot of folks will go right to that. What's this mean from the standpoint of enforceability, or what do I have to adhere to? Anyway, I just offer that as...
Here's a suggestion on our kind of running list of things. We don't know quite what the staff would recommend to Don to achieve your end, but let's highlight a Natoli comment and request to, let's see, what would be a right summary, to highlight the extracted policies and recommendations appearing on Roman numeral 9, 10, 11. I think that would be useful. And that'll keep track of the issue that's out there, meaning the staff would come back to us with whatever you think you can do.
And if staff thinks this is the best flow, then say so. But I mean, from my standpoint, again, as I read documents, and again, read a lot of them, different reasons and types and subject matter, but knowing what, kind of the framework of what's going to be enforceable, that's important, and it is here, but you got to pick the full document, and you might go right to the executive summary,
right,
just as I did several times, including just a moment ago, go right over the top of this. So
yeah, and we may, in fact, recommend something slightly different. So as part of this process, we are going to be writing draft regulations that we send to the Office of Administrative Law that become the enforceable part of the document. So it may be that, in fact, what we will want to do is have something that is it's the 10-page proposed enforceable regulation that won't take effect until and if we get through that process, but at least we have a place for that regulation so anybody can say, here it is, the enforceable part. So we'll think about that.
Okay, good.
And if I may, Chairman Eisenberg, we have created a compilation document that kind of mashes up the executive summary, the policies and recommendations extracted from each chapter, and then the map that depicts the outcomes of the Delta Plan, if you would, or the geographic application of those policies. It's in Chapter 1. So actually, that's what we're presenting to the Protection Commission tonight, so they have a chance to try that on and see if it works. And we're sharing that with the counties that we're meeting with as well, so that they've got a summary document without having to grind through the whole hundreds of pages that we presented in the entire plan.
Okay, that sounds useful.
Mr. Chair.
Gloria.
I just want to kind of reemphasize, I think, what Don was saying. First of all, I think Hank has always talked about the document really needs to be readable, or most folks should be able to look at it and understand it as much as they can. So I know the plan is a legally enforceable plan, and the part of it would be the policy. So I think there should be something that says, I know you have the list of policies and recommendations, but what does that mean? I mean, most folks in our business know it's a policy and you have to adhere to it, but I think simple language that says, you know, I know you have in the narrative section, it says the plan is a legally enforceable document, right? So this is the part of the plan that's legally enforceable. Whatever that means is very clearly what that means. It's state regulations. You know, that's what it means. You have to adhere to it. These are recommendations that does differently. So something that really explains what this means right up front to folks who pick up the document and look at it and say, okay, the Delta Plan, these are the key things that it does, that says that folks should do this. So something that's readable that people can understand real simple. Thank you.
Hank?
Are we going into detail on this?
Yeah, I think we're going through the first stages of this, if you want to. You want to go into which part? Can I just stop you at one place? You've got acronyms and abbreviations on Roman numeral 15, and you've got glossaries at great length on page 295, and there are many of the same things listed in both places, and I can't figure out what it is. And you shouldn't start in acronyms and abbreviations with a scientific formula for microsiemens per centimeter on the list, but that's just me. I mean, if this is if you want to aid reading of references to governmental agencies or commonly used statutes, that's one thing. There's state agencies that aren't involved here. You list Senate bills but no Assembly bills. There's no mention of federal. Figure out what it is you want to do here. I suspect you're going to wind up combining it with the glossaries, which is a more developed list of things, where you also have terminology definitions that are very, very important to the Delta Plan itself.
I can see we're going to need our own ink color for the chair already.
Well, I take the criticism to note, and I apologize for reading the draft.
He'll give you the red pen. He's got it right here. So,
Hank, on the executive summary.
Look, we're going to get down in the weeds. And I guess it's time
Could you get that mic a little closer to you, please?
We're going to get down in the weeds, and this is probably the appropriate time to do that. I think the executive summary is pretty good, and I think some of the discussions we just had will make it even better. I mean, for me, this explains what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, and how we're going to get it done. And the what is to achieve the co-equal goals. And the why is we're reaching the point of no return. You know, if we don't do something now, it's going to be irreparable, both from an environmental standpoint and from the reliable supply of water to the south, which the state needs in order to remain quasi-viable, as it is now. So I would go through this, if you don't mind. I've got a couple changes. A lot of these are style. They don't mean very much. But we in the first page number 3, and the second word in the 5th line, a fulcrum. That's an interesting word. I'm not sure. I can't quite visualize how a fulcrum fits into making decisions. So I've put in there locus, which is a fancy word too, but maybe means a little bit more than fulcrum does. We use the word sustainable repeatedly in this thing, and I think we're being euphemistic here. On line 8, we talk about declaring the Delta are in crisis and that existing Delta policies are not sustainable. How about just not working?
I think that's actually taken from the statute, not that your criticism is invalid.
Well, that makes it more valid then.
Yeah.
On page 35, again, I think we're being overly euphemistic. We talk about the sentence that begins, those restrictions combined with a drought meant water shortages. How about caused water shortages?
Could you say again where you are?
This is page 3, lines 35 and 36.
Thank you.
And the key word there is about 2/3 down, meant. It's a little soft. We referred on page 4, a new path forward, in line 17. The first time we used the word restore. We talk about restoring. Restoring means different things to different people, but it has a very precise definition in the law.
Yep.
And I wonder if we shouldn't even footnote that and put in a definition of restoring.
That also relates to flow issues generally, but it's Water Code Section 85066. That would be worth a footnote, I think.
For explaining what?
Well, for explaining
restore
if it is used in relation to the statutory direction on restoration of the delta, restoring the delta, the legislature put in
Exactly.
this particular language. Now, this may or may not be the right place to footnote it, but there is no doubt about the fact this is one of the few areas where the legislature actually defined a term for us that they use frequently.
We can footnote it and say refer to the definition in another place, or we're talking about 2 lines, so we could do that. I'm indifferent, as long as we make that. On line 40, these are marching orders. Act now and invest sustainably. How about invest big? Act now and invest big. The other stuff is, more of the same sort of thing. I can do this outside the meeting, but I did have a problem on page 5, line number 23, in finding out what that sentence means when it says the Delta Plan seeks to first declining water reliability.
It means it's not a sentence.
That's where we left out the verb.
Is it fix instead of first?
I think it's halt. or
First
rest.
halt, declining.
First stop, halt.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
gotcha. Okay. And in that same paragraph on line 26, generally speaking, these are long-term goals to reverse or reduce increasing long-term environmental impacts due to inaction. I think partly it's inaction. I think partly it's abuses. And if we're going to make this a little bit stronger, because we don't have that many words, I would delete due to inaction and put in from past abuses. And on line 31, again, it's actually line 30 gets back to what Don was talking about. This whole thing works because of the policies and recommendations. And I think we ought to, that's the only teeth that we have in the plan. A little bit it's historical, it's informing, and all the rest of that. But it's really the policy and the recommendations that make this thing work. And we kind of go in, and number 30, through the back door, through its policies and recommendations, the Delta Plan. And I think it deserves a little more highlighting. I think it says the Delta Plan, I can't read my writing, contains policies and recommendations designed to, and make all those verbs to it, rather than increases, I've got improve the water reliability, and go with that, and maybe even uppercase the policy and recommendations. And and rather than increases water supply reliability, that, to me, improved makes more sense. And that's it for me. I think overall it's good. I think with a couple places for emphasis and for clarity. And again, I feel pretty strongly about act now and invest big. And that's really what we're asking the people to do. Mm-hmm. We can't afford to wait any longer. The investment is going to be even larger. And give them something that gets the blood pumping. Rather than invest sustainably, invest big.
Okay, Mr. Grindstaff, your reaction?
I like it. So, and those are good recommendations, and I think our intent is those kinds of things, and even more there will be other things that are more controversial as we move through the plan at the next council meeting. I want to go through all of this kind of stuff and see if we can't get a plan that the council says, yeah, this is really good. So these kinds of changes, I think we will probably bring back to you at the next meeting and say, okay, does everybody agree with these? And put them on the list and ask you to say yes as a council.
Okay. Any other comments on the executive summary?
Is that going to be a thumbs up or a thumbs down in entirety, or are we going to be able to nitpick?
I think it's up to you. You certainly have the ability to nitpick. So,
how about make appropriate changes?
To make appropriate changes, what I would suggest is, for example, the ones that are in here that you just went through, we make those changes and say, if the without objection, the council says yes, and then they become changes. As we get into some others, there will probably be much more detail-oriented comments that you will have to address.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of this is style, but I'm banking on the fact that a lot of the electorate, the people who vote pro or con and have to sustain the increases in their water bills, are going to read only the executive summary, if we can get them to read that. And let's be fairly upfront and even bold if we have to, without exaggerating it unduly.
Agreed.
Yeah. Right. I'm with Hank on almost all of his suggestions on the executive summary. The tone doesn't work for me. It's not as well written as Chapter 1, which I think is a stronger way to and more clear way to explain it. And I'd bet you $100 we're going to come back to the executive summary after we've gone through our process and want to make big revisions in the executive summary, because as we understand better the Delta plan that we're proposing, we'll want to say it in different ways. And that's why I'm not, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it will become the document, I hope, the section of it that you might separately print, that might be available for people to review in summary form rather than us passing out CDs of our entire Delta plan.
Well, when we went to the legislative staff meeting after we did this, actually what I did was we had copies made of executive summary in Chapter 1, because my thought was, yes, you can have the whole document, it's available for download, but not everybody in that room is going to want to read through 500 pages.
And I think the executive summary in Chapter 1 total about 20 pages. Mm-hmm. I think they fit well together. But I did forget, going back to Don's point, on that last section where we're talking about the policies and recommendations, I think at the very least we ought to put in a line saying, and a compilation of these can be found on pages, whatever they are, Romans 9 to something. and some people want to see that, and I think it's a great way to put them.
Right. Sure. Okay, what's your suggestion on proceeding? Just section by section now, chapters? Okay. On chapter 1, comments, the introduction chapter. This is starting on page 9. Don?
I just, on page 18,
Page 18?
18, yeah, the top lines 1 and 2, the kind of the Kennedy-esque reference to, says, the Reform Act recognized that we need to change the way we view the Delta, asking not what we can take, but instead what it can give.
Yeah. How about, in addition, the Delta Reform Act established the policy. The state is to reduce reliance on the Delta and meeting food. I mean, this is an editing grammatical change, but it should be made.
I wasn't suggesting any change in that. I noted that as a bit philosophical, but certainly I think reflective of the legislation and obviously some of the work that's being done here. So again, I wasn't suggesting any change.
I'm sorry, what page are you on?
This is page 18.
18. Don was talking about lines 1, 2,
Yeah, but I
1 and
wasn't
2.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting any change. I just would make a comment more than anything else. It's fine.
I actually like it.
No, as I said, it was kind of in the realm of what Kennedy put out a few decades ago about what you're doing for your country.
On the introduction chapter on page 9, just a suggestion. Lines 8 through 12 essentially are a reference to the water code sections that defines the delta as this delta in Suisun Marsh. Because the rest of the introduction is a narrative explanation of the delta, the changes in 163 years of history and all of that, it's kind of jarring to put a code section. That's a perfect place, I think, to make a footnote out of that text, because it is an important point to make that the statute defines the deltas, including the Suisun Marsh, as does the delta plan, except explicitly when it doesn't. But it should, it just interferes with, I think, the narrative, which is a terrific kind of narrative. Mr. Grindstaff, how do you want to treat charts? I mean, I'll give you all of my details on all of the charts I've raised questions with, or you can should we set a time at the next session to go through them? What's your preference?
Go ahead, Cindy. We actually had a plan to address charts, but I'll let her talk about it.
We do, and actually I was going to try to bring this up at some point today, but we've been working on setting up a time in the next couple of weeks to go through with Larry Orman, to have some discussion, go through the entire draft plan, all the graphics, talk about things like color scheme, placement, any changes that need to be made. So I haven't really carefully thought through how to bring all of the comments into that process, but we can keep the council members apprised. We can come back at the next council meeting, report on the meeting we've had with Larry, kind of the game plan from there. But
when are you going to be ready, do you think?
To start making the actual changes? Probably within the next...
One of the challenges always is with the graphic content of a publication, of course, is you've got design issues and kind of space issues and how do things fit out. I think what would be helpful if you have concerns or there's things you think need to be depicted that aren't, if you could identify those for us earlier, we can begin working on them. It may be that we can't complete the work before we're presenting a final draft to or before you're acting on the final draft, because it takes time for the graphics folk to pull things together in different formats. But if we had an understanding of what the council thought needed to be added, we could get working on it sooner.
Okay. Page 10, figure 1.1 is captioned Delta Watershed and Legal Delta. The map, of course, I believe, is the environmental impact study area for the Delta plan, which is not limited to the watershed or the legal Delta, since it involves service areas and also involves the Trinity River watershed. Also, there is no source for the chart. Page 11, chart on precipitation by water year. There was earlier, both in Delta Vision and in draft Delta plans, a trend line over time. There was also a rolling 5-year average, which Gwen tends to favor as a way, but neither are there now, and the narrative does not explain all of that. I mean, there has to be a reason why there's not a trend line.
I'll explain why there's not a trend line, because I don't think that a trend is statistically significant, and it misleads people into believing that there is actually a trend. The main point of the graphic is the variability, and having either the trend line or the 5-year might lead people who are reading the chart to believe, oh, the trend is up or the trend is down, and in fact, we don't have the data that would support that. What we really have here is a chart that shows there's great variability, and that's why we don't have the trend lines on it.
So it is true or false that we receive, on average, the same or nearly the same amount of water as we have since 1895? On average.
On average, by definition, it's true. You could also draw a line, and there used to be a line on this chart that showed the average annual precipitation, and that line went up. I think that was misleading because, in fact, we don't know that that line is going up, and all that does is reflect that over this period of time, if you average it this way, that's what your line looks like. In the same way, if you use a 5-year trend, then your line varies, but neither one of them are statistically significant or convey real information. They can convey what I will call pseudo-information that make people assume things that aren't true. So the truth is
like what?
That as you look at it, you can see that it's close to the same thing, but it varies a lot. And to assume more than that is too much. Even if you look into the future, the climate change models pretty much all say that it's going to decrease in the future. But
Precipitation?
Precipitation.
No, I read that the composition changes more heavily based on rain and less on snow.
We focus on that a lot. But if you look at the models, what I was going to say is most go down. There are some that go up. And the dividing line about where it goes down and goes up is right around Sacramento. In some places, some cases, the dividing line is at Redding. And so the information is so equivocal there, or the modeling is so equivocal that I think we can't make assumptions, and that's why we assume it's the same. Everyone agrees that we're changing the phases so that we have more rain and less snow, and that snowpack has big impacts on how much water is available and how much we can use it. But it's to do more than the data supports is something I want to fight against, including there.
Does that suggest then that a reliable water supply in California depends upon a day-to-day, month-to-month, and year calculation and nothing more? And that is, it's so erratic and so uncertain that by its very nature, there can be no reliability that's meaningful.
I don't think I would go that far, but it does mean I think I'm sorry for getting so technical. There was a science paper that we circulated
right.
between each other about that we got from Dr. Goodwin called something about stationarity, saying wither stationarity, what does that mean for water management? Mm-hmm. And the wither stationarity said, basically, we don't know what's going to happen, and we in the water business need to really begin thinking about the assumptions that we've always made in the past, that the future will be the same as it has been for the last 100 or 200 years, whatever our assumptions are, because that's not likely to be true. So I think we can do things that improve water supply reliability, but we need to begin thinking about how the system itself is changing and will change, and understand that we don't have all of the answers.
But Joe, I must admit, I'm confused by the use of the word average, particularly on the vertical axis. It says average inches per year. It's inches per year.
It is inches per year.
It's
and
not
I think
average unless you average the number of years.
You're absolutely right. I think the average on that chart is incorrect.
I think also on the horizontal axis. It's not average annual precipitation by water year. It's precipitation by water year.
That's absolutely correct.
And the annual is already in there when you mention year.
That's correct.
And the average you don't need.
Right. It's annual precipitation.
Or,
And inches.
or precipitation in inches per year.
I think, why don't we check that back with the source? It could be that what this is depicting, the rainfall varies in different parts of the state, and so, in some years it could be up in San Diego and down in Crescent City, so this may be depicting kind of the average annual rainfall in measuring stations around the state. So let us go back to the source and check
Let's
this
flag
out.
to return 1.2.
Yeah, because it's confusing. Otherwise, you could have it. You could
That's
have,
correct.
say, 1 year and the rainfall in 3 different sections.
Yeah, because this is...
And then you could talk about an average annual.
Yeah, Jessica has pointed out that the caption verifies that this is the average of rainfall in 95 different stations around the state.
Measurement stations, yeah.
So it actually is an average of
Okay.
rainfall in different parts of the state.
Wouldn't that 95 comprise the entire state? Would that be representative, or do the inches not mean anything?
We'll have to go back and check the source to make sure we know what we're presenting to you.
It is intended, as I recall, from seeing the original document, to be an average for the state.
Can I, page 14, the delta by the numbers, which I liked a lot. I like the chart. It's helpful. I just noted on the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth box, and I didn't have time to check it. Approximately 57% of the delta in Suisun Marsh, more than 48,000 acres of ag land currently supports blah, blah, blah. Are those the same figures we use in the delta as place chapter later? I mean, one of the things, to the extent you can, we ought to try to use identical or comparable figures throughout the document. I didn't have a chance to check it.
I didn't check this one. I know that was our intent, to check all of these to
Okay.
make sure they were consistent.
Okay. Page 16, Governance in the Delta Reform Act, lines 11 and 12. I didn't understand whether, during these drought years, average runoff to the state's 2 largest rivers dipped precariously 44% to the Sacramento River. Does that mean 44% less water to the Sacramento? Or that Sacramento declined to 44% of? I just didn't understand the reference. That's just a drafting point. On the chart there, is more governance reform needed? Just a suggestion. Take the description of the Little Hoover Commission and PPIC, make it a footnote somewhere, because the narrative really runs from the 2 government agencies have proposed new water and governance models. The follow should be those 5 bullet points that are the recommendation, and it kind of breaks up the narrative of what you're doing. page 18, 20, 19 and 20, I'm sorry, 18, 21, and 22, which are the text stuff. We've got so many bullet points about the Delta plan that we can't keep track of it. First of all, the first four, the practical, foundational, integrated adoption, is okay. But then we go into policies and recommendations based on lessons learned, act now, improve water supply. And then we do it just doesn't, there are too many categories of boxes that do the same thing. On page 21, Diamond 2 is improve water supply reliability. Diamond 5 is increase California water supply reliability. Now, maybe there's a way, it's like it's a duplication as opposed to a different discussion. Chart page 19, which is one of the most interesting charts. I have not gone to the computer to see if the electronic version is more clear with the superimposition of various patterns and colors and all that. But just a question, are we trying to do too much with this one map? I know there's no easy answer to that, but it's hard to identify urban and urbanizing areas, which include city boundaries and spheres of influence and so on and so forth, and then land use, then water features, then ecosystem restoration. It just...
That's a good example, I think, of sort of when we've arrived at a final draft, our ability to work with a graphic designer to improve the visual quality of things. Right now, of course, we're just trying to depict some basic ideas.
Yeah, I think, the thing that's really valuable about this map is you can look at it, and particularly for the restoration areas, you can identify visually what the narrative talks about. And that's really important, particularly for a general reader of the plan. But when you get very specific on some of these things, the colors seem to blur, or maybe they just, due to old eyes, they seem to blur. And I couldn't figure out easily county boundaries or other boundaries as well. But anyway, I'd take a look at it. It is a terrific, this map is a good foundational map, but there are a lot of things going on it. Page 22, what the Delta plan will achieve by 2100. And just a question: our predictability changes? We have not adjusted the population changes of California to reflect the Department of Finance recently adjusted estimations of population. And should we not do that? Because we're using the DOF, Department of Finance 2007 estimation, and I can't remember precisely, but I think the Department of Finance just reduced their estimate by 8 million people over the next, 20 years or something like that. And do we have a prediction on urban growth under this notion that should be put in here? You've got the anticipated change.
In terms, are you suggesting a forecast for a footprint for urban areas in the state?
For the Delta, this is really what we're trying to identify what the Delta plan will achieve. And, I don't know, it's I don't know. Pat?
I don't believe we have a forecast of the urban footprint in the future. There is one proposed in the Delta Protection Commission's Delta's Place report. I'll go back and look at their economic sustainability plan. I doubt it's for the same period. And of course, that forecast was done without respect to the land use policies that the local cities and counties have got in place. So it may not be so applicable to what we're trying to deal with here.
On page 23, the 3 diamond points are over the life of the Delta Plan, 3 things. This is a shorthand version of what Jessica had in, was it the 4th draft, Jessica, and the 5th draft too? This is the Delta Plan we look to for the future, or looking out to 2100. Remember you had that nice narrative stuff that went on.
Right.
Just a suggestion, particularly on the second diamond, Delta and Suisun Marsh. Over the life of the Delta Plan, the ecosystem will have the capacity to provide all the environmental and societal benefits the public demands? Really? All? And public? I mean, I like the way you stated it in the previous versions, where you used statutory language and had some less adventuresome pledge. All is something that caught my attention. And then last thing for me, which is page 24, which is your timeline for priority actions. I particularly on the action depends on, so for example, reduced reliance on the Delta. You have state, local agency cooperation. Well, actually, it requires compliance. The Delta Plan is based on the statute that imposes reduced reliance as a goal of the state of California. And it's not an agreement, it's a direction. And so my suggestion is that state, local agency compliance is probably a more accurate word.
Well, it will also depend on local investment and the decisions people outside the Delta make about how they pursue the improvement of their local water supplies.
Right.
And certainly, few agencies, including the council, are not in a position to direct that. We can deal with people who have got actions in the Delta that affect that, but that will require the cooperation of all the various parties that are involved in water supply.
I don't mind compliance and cooperation, but the notion that we leave the impression it is a voluntary action is not consistent with law. Both with the decreased reliance and also the 20% mandatory reduction in urban areas. If it were me writing this, and when you say one of the actions needed is the update Delta flow objectives, with which I agree, action depends on State Water Board compliance on time. The more honest statement is no political delays to the process. That's the more honest statement. That's what I'd say. I leave it for your consideration or the council's consideration, but that's actually, I think, what's at stake. Also on the third, priority of state investment. This is where I'd put a duty on us, because we are proposing in this Delta Plan, we're declaring in the Delta Plan, that we will adopt recommended investment strategies by 2015. And if you tie that to what the Central Valley Flood Board is supposed to be doing, you've got 2 pieces that are really essential. And so I'd say it relies on the council completing its investment strategy, the Central Valley Flood Board plan, and the legislature implementing it. And that, it's a good idea I think, to plug in our own duties under the plan. Then you've got some blanks in here. National Heritage Area, it's really federal action that establishes it. Why wouldn't we put in federal action?
I'm sorry, what was that?
On the, let's see what the line, designate the Delta as National Heritage Area. He's got Congress over there, but under action depends on, there is no notation, which, I mean, either it depends on something or it depends on nothing. And it depends on, I just written federal action.
Yeah, depends on the
The president
Congress.
could do it by an executive order, and I think that's right. I could be wrong. Okay. And then on the development of a Delta Science program under the recommendations, that's where I'd also put our date, because it's a reminder to ourselves that we have promised to deliver a product on a date certain. And I think we need to prod ourselves to move on a time schedule, not just prod other people.
Some of our performance measures also include dates as well. So
Yeah, I know they do, and some of them, I guess we've moved a bunch of them back into the appendix. I'm sorry, Joe, remind me again which of the performance measures got moved. They're
The administrative.
administrative things, yeah. Okay. But this chart, which I like a lot, the timeline chart, I like the looks of it, I like what you're trying to do. This chart will have a more active life than the entire Delta plan as a collective group. People will pull these charts out, and they'll say, well, this is what you're supposed to do. It's what everyone's supposed to do. So these are big deals, and I like to look at it. I think you've done a good graphic job, and these are just kind of editing changes. Hey, Pat.
I wanted to look at page 15, but
Whoops.
page 15.
1-5?
Yeah. This page has the arresting heading, the Delta problem. So, as part of the introduction, it would be worth us, I think, making sure that little essay was as good as it could be, whatever that might mean. So I'm not suggesting I know what that is, but as I read it, I thought of some things, but I really offer them as now or with staff in the future to think about how to have that page as the snapshot photo at the front of the photo album, that it might matter. So, for instance, I would take starting line 7 and break up that long sentence and say it a little differently. Today, the Delta is not meeting the demands of farmers and urban water users who want certainty of supply and, in most cases, more water, period. So part of that is substance, not style. Saying that the Delta's got a problem because it doesn't meet the needs of farmers or urban water users means that those entities demands for water equal their need for water. And they're clearly demands. Whether they are needs, well, I think in some cases that's debatable. So I would substitute the word demands for needs. And I'd say it wants certainty of supply, and in most cases, more water, period. Not more water from the Delta. It may be from the Delta, but I'd say they're probably fairly agnostic. It's more affordable water. It may be from the Delta. Nor, and then I'd begin the next sentence,
So it doesn't all run together, nor does the delta adequately serve the needs of fish and wildlife. And here I'd say needs because the fish and wildlife don't get to speak for themselves, but we can measure how they're doing. So there is presumably or hopefully a scientific description of what their needs are. Some threatened or endangered species numbers remain perilously low. Wouldn't change any of that. And the last sentence, and the delta itself remains an inherently flood-prone and in many places inadequately protected. So that's just language change. But in terms of editing, not with regard to content, the next paragraphs, it occurred to me that maybe the eye would read this better if in bold you had, in effect, a subheadline, but it need not be broken out. It'd just be the start of the line. So on line 11, it would start, fish declines in bold, period, and then it would go on to say in late 2004. Because we go from the first two paragraphs of saying the delta is really big, really important, water supply, ecosystem, delta flood risk, and then we dive in late 2004. So that must be a really important date because it's 2004. It follows from that. So fish decline, and that paragraph tells you that's what we're talking about. And line 17, it started with, in bold, water exports cut, period. So bad things for fish. What happens next? People get less water exported. Line 26, I'd put lawsuits, period. That's what it's about. Court-ordered decisions that affect water delivery as well as the ecosystem. Line 35, just flood threats, period. And line 40, pursuit of balance, period. So what we're saying is the fish decline, water exports cut, lawsuits happen, flood threats, and then pursuit of balance. And so what we're doing is trying to find our way to this co-equal goals. But the use of the bold in that is just a trick to have the eye see where you're going.
Randy.
I have a process comment. I think at the rate we're going, we're going to run out of time and people before we get through the 8 chapters. Let me recommend that we continue to comb through the introduction and let that serve as council's opportunity to share about the areas that still have some concerns about, and then receive a report from staff in June about those issues and some recommendations and so on. And along those lines, because we probably won't get to it as we go through the introduction, I'd like to recommend that the finance chapter receive a little extra attention next month, and even to the degree of bringing in some panelists to discuss with us what could be included in a finance plan, and then give the council an opportunity to deliberate that chapter after hearing from some expert panelists. It's the one chapter that hasn't received a lot of attention in all of our deliberations thus far, and I think it's worthy of a little extra attention beyond the policies and recommendations that we find in the other chapters. So, in summary, I'd like to suggest that we just we're going to lose some council members here pretty soon, travel reasons, and unless somebody else has got a better idea, I would say limit our comments to Chapter 1, or review of Chapter 1, and then I'd really like to hear from the audience. And I want to make sure that we get to that point before everybody gets so weary and leaves. So I think that's going to be probably a very important part of this meeting, is to hear from the public.
I think that's probably a wise admonition for us to follow, Joe.
One thing that struck me on Chapter 1, a lot of the people who read this are going to be aware of the talk about a peripheral canal years ago and about a tunnel today. And we've done the executive summary and the introduction. And there's no mention of either one, is there? I mean, should we not say this is under the guise of the BDCP, and they're tasked with coming up with a means of conveyance and storage, and we're going to wait until that happens? Or is that considered just ducking the issue?
I agree with you. You cannot tell the story of California's water environmental fights without mentioning one of the biggest points of contention and dispute and semi-resolution in history. I agree with that. It is mentioned elsewhere in the narrative, but Chapter 3, I guess. Yeah.
Good point.
Okay. How about this, members? Let's start and get some public comment on at this point. If there is not a lot more public comment, we can return to some of the chapters before members leave. But let's.
Well, can we talk about this issue both sides, or just pass it by? What are we going to do with this?
Which one?
Peripheral canal tunnel.
Oh.
Are we going to hand it off to another committee, or are we going to address it?
Well, we're ordered by law to incorporate BDCP if it successfully meets the requirements of the law. And we're also ordered to be a potential appellate body, which has prevented us from voting yes or no on the very idea of improvements of the existing facility. Mentioning it as part of the historical narrative seems to me is eminently it's required. It's an obvious thing to do. Did you want to do more than that?
I think we ought to say what you just basically said. We are not tasked with that. The recommendation is coming from another agency, and when we get that recommendation, we'll see it. But clearly, that has to be addressed.
Yeah, in some ways, one of the chapters that we're not going to talk about today, but Chapter 2, which is a merger of both the science component and the process, includes kind of a good way to explain what goes on in this process. And we all, see if I remember correctly, we also have a section there on BDCP. Chris, unless I got moved around. Yeah, on page 43, we've got the incorporation. But you're suggesting a more publicly understandable statement of the issue.
I'm saying we ought to do it up front.
Okay.
And I think, we can talk about the benefits of either a tunnel or a peripheral canal. And you can put it in a historical perspective, if you want. But saying that, the need for the consideration of something has not diminished over the years.
Right now, that text is on page 21 in the bullets about improving water supply reliability and committing to Delta restoration. But we can highlight the roles, the way in which it's played in the history of the Delta in the past, and the way it'll play out as the BDCP is acted upon in the future.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is it's highlighted. It's kind of like the elephant in the room. And people are going to expect to hear at least sounds of the elephant or about the elephant. And I think it'll be funny if it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Let's do this. Let's have the staff give a shot at that and come back to us at the June meeting.
Well, and my sense is that what we will need to do is take this first chapter in executive summary comments and try and write down, here are all the things that we heard and the changes that we're making based on what the council told us. And as we are with the errata, we'll ask you to approve that, and so we'll have a record of what we're doing. And so this is one of the changes. We'll try and incorporate more explicit discussion of the tunnel and the peripheral canal in this chapter.
Just clarification, in the executive summary, is that where you're going to put it?
I was going to put it in Chapter 1, where we have already some discussion here. So,
Well, if the executive summary is going to be perhaps published by itself, I would suggest you put it there.
Well, I want to repeat, I'll bet you at the end of the process on the Delta plan, we're going to have a more clear view of what ought to be in the executive summary, what will not be. And I also bet you that the executive summary in Chapter 1 may start to look, may bleed over. They bleed over anyway. They
we
cover,
may end up combining them into one.
It's remotely possible to combine them.
Yeah, we talked about that actually as drafting it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Pat, we've got some requests to speak.